Christian proponents of theistic evolution believe that the creation account described in the book of Genesis and evolution do not contradict one another. The internet apologist Inspiring Philosophy explains this view in more detail, but before that he addresses some Bible passages which seem to imply that the earth is immovable because it rests on pillars.
So what of verses like Psalm 93:1 and Psalm 104:5 that says the earth doesn't move? Dr. Lennox says, "We now know that the earth does not rest on literal foundations or literal pillars. We can therefore see that the words foundation and pillars are used in a metaphorical sense."
This is a non sequitur. How does Lennox know that these words are used in a metaphorical sense? The simple answer is, he doesn't, he just assumes it without justification. Furthermore, Lennox ignores one obvious alternative, namely that the Hebrew authors of the Old Testament had no clue about the actual shape of the earth.
Even though our interpretation relies on scientific knowledge, it does not compromise the authority of Scripture. And this is the important thing. Scripture has the primary authority. Experience and science have helped to decide between possible interpretations that Scripture allows.
This might sound persuasive to someone who's already a Christian, but skeptics who doubt that Scripture is the primary authority will point out that this is an incredibly lame argument.
Many have argued that the Genesis creation account must be understood literally, but is this the way it was intended to be read? Did the author of Genesis write the creation account like a historical narrative? When you study the evidence, I think the reasonable answer is no.
And I think the answer is yes.
Two things should be noticed when reading the creation account. The language is very poetic and very vague. The Hebrew scholar Edward J. Young notes that the creation account seems to be too poetic to be read as a historical narrative. Every day begins with, "Then God said," and contains repeated phrases such as, "And God saw that it was good," "Let there be," and "It was so." Repetitions such as these are not typical for historical narratives.
I'm convinced that this is irrelevant, because poetry on its own has nothing to do with history. Certain chapters and texts of the Bible written in poetic language, and yet supposedly they refer to genuine historical events. Take Numbers 23 or Psalm 78 for example. Moreover, the creation account is most definitely not pure poetry as IP would have you believe. To quote Gordon J. Wenham in his book Genesis 1-15, extra-biblical creation stories from the ancient Near East are usually poetic, but Genesis 1 is not typical Hebrew poetry. Indeed, some writers endeavoring to underline that Genesis 1 is pure priestly theology insist that it is not poetry at all. On the other hand, Genesis 1 is not normal Hebrew prose either. Its syntax is distinctively different from narrative prose. So in that sense, Genesis 1 is elevated prose, not pure poetry. What's more is that it does not contain the most frequently used rhetorical device in Hebrew poetry, namely parallelism.
Now the second thing to note is the language is very vague. What I mean is the words used throughout the chapter can easily be interpreted several different ways. Take the Hebrew word yom. In the creation account, this is the word for day. However, the same word is used throughout Scripture for other words, such as daylight, time, year, ago, always, season, continually, ever, and age. So we cannot be sure that the days in the creation account are supposed to be interpreted as literal 24-hour days.
Now technically this is correct. The word yom can indeed refer to a longer period of time. However, if it is accompanied by a numeral, it does in fact mean a literal day, and to my knowledge there are no exceptions to this rule. Additionally, many, if not most of the biblical scholars agree that the author of Genesis had days in mind, not eons. Again, I'm quoting Gordon J. Wenham. There can be little doubt that here day has its basic sense of a 24-hour period. The mention of morning and evening, the enumeration of the days and the divine rest on the seventh, show that a week of divine activity is being described here. Now don't get me wrong here, I am very happy to see that Inspiring Philosophy speaks against biblical literalism. Creationism is a laughable worldview, and every Christian who endorses it just makes a fool out of himself. But while creationism is indeed scientifically absurd, it might be theologically defensible. I fear that the same cannot be said about theistic evolution.